Latin America, as in other parts of the world, the advance of communism led to the creation of armed insurgent groups who claimed to either seek social justice or rise up against repressive governments. In Colombia, what began as a peasant militia in the mid-1960s mutated over the decades into one of the deadliest criminal organizations on earth. It was called FARC, and it spread like cancer throughout the country, pushing back the state and, at one point, seriously threatening the capital, Bogotá. For decades, Colombia was incapable of dealing with multiple and simultaneous security threats. Not just FARC, but powerful and ruthless drug cartels, as well as right-wing paramilitary groups that rose to fill the void left by a weak central government. The loss of territorial control, both militarily and socially, sent Colombia into a deep tailspin that would take years to turn around. A new political constitution in 1991 had opened the door to a more modern and transparent democracy. However, weak local governments in many rural areas enabled illegal armed groups to seize control of resources and to co-opt local governance. While many insurgent groups had demobilized, the FARC continued to grow by moving up the lucrative cocaine production chain, from taxing coca leaf to distributing the finished product. The spreading cancer had found the perfect fuel to metastasize. Also in the early 90s, several reforms had begun to modernize Colombia's security forces. In the previous decade, the police had been infiltrated by corruption and narco-trafficking, but it steadily began to transform itself under charismatic leadership that acted courageously. In just a few years, the Colombian National Police had gained the trust of its citizens and the support of key international allies. The police was a beacon of light in an otherwise dark time. The FARC, flush with cash from drug money and facing a president who was severely weakened internationally, launched a massive military offensive. In many regions of Colombia, they pushed government forces out. The military and police both suffered demoralizing and brutal setbacks. Fear gripped the cities. The systematic and indiscriminate use of kidnapping trapped people in urban centers. A siege mentality began to creep into the national consciousness, and many believed that it was now possible for the FARC to seize power. In the late 90s, the government launched a sort of Colombian Marshall Plan with assistance from the United States. The combination of military and social investment in Plan Colombia sought to counter the existential threats posed by narco-trafficking to the Colombian state. Around the same time, the government and the FARC had entered into a period of fruitless peace talks in which the state had ceded an enormous demilitarized safe haven in exchange for nothing. After many months, an exhausted and disillusioned population did not want empty rhetoric anymore. And as negotiations collapsed, a political outsider who promised to militarily confront the FARC began to rise rapidly in the presidential polls of 2002. Álvaro Uribe's basic premise: to retake territorial control of the country by restoring state presence in every municipality. His strategy capitalized on a transformed and more professional military that now enjoyed as much legitimacy as the national police. President Uribe created new battalions, mobile brigades, and specialized police units, deploying them to places long neglected by the state. A post-September 11 climate allowed US resources to be shifted from assisting only in counter-narcotic actions to supporting broader counter-narco-terrorism operations. This turned out to be a critical element. For the first time in history, no part of the territory was beyond the reach of Colombian government forces. International recognition and support for the legitimacy of Colombia's democratic security policy was vital in the government's success. Another crucial component was a special war tax levied on the country's wealthiest citizens that financed the expansion of all security forces. Early military victories and people's freedom of movement between cities were signals that the tide was turning. Joint commands, troop mobility, shared intelligence, night operations and surgical strikes became the hallmarks of an increasingly confident and effective military and police. gaining a reputation as being among the best in the world. Not all was perfect. The armed forces were accused of grave human rights violations, and these eventually led to difficult but necessary structural reforms. Legitimacy became the center of gravity of all operations. The government also created an interagency planning and coordination center that brought military, police, and civilian authorities together to design multifaceted interventions in priority areas. It was critical to begin addressing inequality and poverty issues hand in hand with security. After several years, progress was steady and sometimes dramatic, if not always even. In most large and medium cities, prosperity increased while terrorism and kidnapping practically ceased to exist. But in some rural and remote areas, there were some pockets of resistance still capable of inflicting limited but real damage. Colombia is a large country. The second half of the 20th century was witness to a lengthy, violent struggle for territorial control. On its road to stability and prosperity, Colombia learned three basic lessons. If the people do not support government security forces, these must be reformed and their legitimacy and credibility restored. If military and police actions are not accompanied by simultaneous and coordinated social interventions, victory will be fleeting. And lastly, only a sustained, integrated effort by the state will be able to outlast the enemy.